Okay, hello and welcome everyone. This is the UC Center Sacramento Speaker Series. It's Wednesday. I'm Richard Kravitz. I'm director here at UC Center Sacramento, and this is the fifth and last session of our special winter symposium on chronic homelessness and mental health, where we're examining the problem of chronic homelessness and its relationship to mental health conditions, substance use, and other social ills. So those of you who've been with us from the very beginning for this symposium know that we've already heard from Elizabeth Tallman at UCSD, who spoke about some of the neurocognitive underpinnings of the mental health conditions that are associated with homelessness. We heard from Amy Mullen and Mayor Darrell Steinberg about the revolving door between the streets and the healthcare system. From Enrico Castillo at UCLA, who spoke about some innovative solutions apparent in Houston and as far away as Finland. And then last week from Margot Cushell, Senator John Laird, and Toby Ewing from the Mental Health Commission, who discussed contrasting frameworks and solutions to chronic homelessness. But today, we're going to take a step back and look into the past under the assumption that understanding the past is necessary in order to chart a reasonable future course and begin to climb our way out of the mess that we find ourselves in. To help us, I'm pleased to welcome Professor Joel Braslow. Dr. Braslow is professor in the Department of Psychiatry and History at UCLA, and he's the Francis F. O'Malley Endowed Chair in Neuroscience History there. He combines psychiatric practice with research into the ways our conception and treatment of mental illness have evolved over the past 100 years. He's author of the book Mental Ills and Bodily Cures, as well as many scholarly articles covering topics as diverse as teaching critical thinking to psychiatric residents, the evolution of psychotherapeutics since World War II, perspectives of individuals living with chronic mental illnesses, and the manufacture of the so-called recovery movement. He has a BS from Stanford, an MD from Loma Linda, and received his PhD in history from UCLA. So we're very pleased, Professor Braslow, to have you here today to give us these perspectives. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Richard, and thanks so much for inviting me. Speaking of history, Richard and I were trying to figure out when we first met each other, and it was a long time ago. Sort of shockingly a long time ago. But I think as a preface to what I have to say is that I see myself first and foremost as a psychiatrist, and I was trained as a psychiatrist before I did history, and the reason why I did history was precisely because I was really curious about why we do what we do as psychiatrists and how we got to where we are. So that being said, even if I get a little lost in the history, there is a purpose to it, where I think history really does help inform what we do today. And so in thinking about the talk today and thinking about the history of homelessness and incarceration for people with serious mental illness, it actually has a fairly long, thinking about it, has a long history, and that history, I think, really does help us understand better where we are today. There are four different kind of periods of time that I want to go over. I'm going to try to focus more on the last two periods, because I think it really is most informative for the present. And so the four epochs is this period before we had what we call psychiatric disease now. And so our psychiatric disease as a disease, as we think about it today, is relatively new. And I'll talk about that just briefly. Before the 1700s, let's say, there wasn't a notion of psychiatric disease as we have today. The second period of time is the birth of the asylum and the creation of our modern idea of psychiatric disease. What is the most important, I think, for us thinking about homelessness and incarceration, and again, homelessness and incarceration of people with serious mental illness, I just want to emphasize it because this is a theme throughout the talk, helped drive many of the changes within psychiatry. So the birth of the asylum is a good example of homelessness and the jailing of people with serious mental illness led largely to the creation of asylums in the first half of the 19th century. So what last two parts are going to be on kind of asylums and the state hospitals, and deinstitutionalization, and then kind of trying to understand the relationship between deinstitutionalization and our current crisis of homelessness and the jailing of people with serious mental illness. So just briefly, prior to the 18th century, conceptions of mental illness could be a variety of ways of both attributing cause to mental illness and making sense out of it, from religious ecstasy to demonic possession to humoral imbalances to a disordered body that was somehow affecting the mind but not a diseased mind. That because the soul was deeply involved at especially before we started the secularization of thinking about the distinction between brain and mind, so that generally speaking, it was thought of disordered bodies, not disordered minds. So this is just to give an example of a demonic possession, and it's from a painting from the 15th century, and it's just depicting the blessing of a possessed youth, and you can see that demon is fleeing after he's being blessed. And this is kind of a complicated picture, but it's just showing depicting the four humors, and a different variety of combinations could lead to both your kind of personality, but then also an imbalance of humors could eventually lead to madness. So jumping to the the birth of the asylum and the creation of psychiatric illness, it's a complicated history, but I want to just kind of summarize that. In the 18th and 19th centuries, it was when madness became a disease of the body and brain and mind, and so that we could start thinking about how do you treat psychiatric madness as a medical illness. This, however, this kind of moment required major social, cultural, economic changes that led to the birth of the asylum, which was a precondition really in some ways, but also of being able to classify madness and to have psychiatrists ultimately taking care of people with serious mental illness. So what I want to do, just really briefly touch upon some of the major kind of social, economic, and political changes that allowed the asylum to be constructed, or the need for asylums for people with serious mental illness to even arise. Western Europe and North America underwent very radical transformation, both in terms of politically, economically, and socially. And that not only were there major kind of revolutions in terms of like in Britain and the US, but also, and probably more in some ways thoroughgoing, was the Industrial Revolution. And the Industrial Revolution underpinned many of the changes that would occur within families, within communities, that made asylum care, in some sense, necessary for the care and treatment of people who had serious mental illness. So just to give you an example, this is just showing urbanization in the UK, and you can just see how quickly from rural to urban settings, so there's this mass migration of people moving from the countryside into cities, and it's over a fairly short period of time when you think about it. What you can see here is that a similar phenomenon is happening in the United States as well. This was brought about by the Industrial Revolution largely, and the consequences of this has made it increasingly difficult for families to care for disabled loved ones, in particular disabled loved ones who had psychiatric disorder, what we would call today psychiatric disorders. So what became increasingly evident throughout in this period of time was a growing population of individuals who were homeless, were being incarcerated, jailed, and so the late 18th, 19th century is this period of time where we have this growing social problem, but also, at the same time, a reformulation of madness as being a medical illness that could affect both body and mind. And simultaneously, both in France and in England, you have this kind of recreation of what counts as therapeutic, and you have the creation of what was of the asylum in terms of it being a therapeutic institution where insanity was seen as much like a disease like any other that could be treated and was curable. But the most significant part of it was that it was curable by what was called moral therapy. I think I want some water, actually, which I left my water. Fortunately, I didn't leave it. It's right here. Sorry. I left it over there. Just really briefly, moral therapy, and moral refers to the mind, not moral as in good or bad. It's in terms of it, since it was developed in France, the French term, and it was Philippe Pinel is most famously associated with moral therapy, and he was a Parisian physician, and William Tuke in England. And what moral therapy did is it provided the intellectual and organizational rationale for what would become the asylum and then later the state hospital for the 20th century. This painting here is a really famous painting that is depicting Philippe Pinel, who is supposedly removing the chains from an insane woman at the Salpêtrière. Even though that probably isn't really what happened, but it is a good image of suggesting the importance of transforming what had once been seen as criminality or some form of demonic possession, instead as a medical illness that could be treated. This is William Tuke, who was in Great Britain, who was a Quaker, who helped found the York Retreat, also based on very similar principles. So what is moral therapy? So I'm just going to read this since... and so moral therapy, recreating a family-like setting, moral therapy aimed to re-educate the mad and appeal to their rationality through a humane and caring environment. Tuke and Pinel renounced physical restraints and emphasized persuasion over overt coercion in effecting a cure. Through meaningful activities, useful labor, and seclusion from the exciting causes of madness, moral therapy provided the ideological support for the creation of what would become a vast network of publicly funded asylums. So what I'd like to do now is just now make a pretty big leap to the age of the asylum. So, and when I'm talking about the age of the asylum, I'm thinking of the period of time from the mid-19th century to the mid-1950s, where states and governments outside of the United States invested vast amounts of funds into caring for people with serious mental illness. So throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, state mental health budgets generally accounted for, kind of shockingly, the lion's share of expenditures. Massive spending across the United States would create really a gargantuan network of 19th century asylums, which then were rechristened state hospitals. Nothing fundamentally changed except the name. State hospital sounded much more scientific and therapeutic. Surprisingly, some states' budgets, state hospital budget, in some states accounted for a quarter to a third of the entire expenditures on the part of the state government. So it's really kind of a remarkable amount of funding for public welfare. And just as the erosion of the family and traditional forms of care had led to the creation of the asylum in the first place, the same social forces that fueled this new era of state-sponsored, mental health care helped generate, the need for this massive system of mental health care that was funded by the state. And what is remarkable at this period of time is what the engine that propelled state government, state legislatures to spend such massive amounts of money, relatively speaking, was this growing number of individuals who were insane that were incarcerated in jails, in prisons, in almhouses. And so it has a parallel to today, obviously. Reformers and advocates were especially aghast at the conditions they found individuals with, that had psychiatric disorders. They were acutely aware of those afflicted with insanity were increasingly becoming homeless, forced, as I mentioned, into almshouses or jailed. Given the early mid-19th century conviction that insanity was a disease and that asylums could provide humane medical care and treatment, it was, from their perspective, unconscionable that a civilized society would let homelessness, incarceration of individuals afflicted with a medical illness, to go untreated. And so the most famous of these is the quote I have here this is Dorothea Lynn Dix, who she began, this is from an 1843 publication, a report to the Massachusetts legislature, where what she described as outrages upon humanity and legalized barbarity. And she wrote, I proceed, gentlemen, to briefly call your attention to the present state of insane persons confined within this Commonwealth, in cages, stalls, and pens, chained, naked, beaten with rods, and lashed into obedience. And again, this is prior to the Massachusetts funding an enormous, a large system of state hospitals. They were on the verge of it. But these types of concerns really helped propel them into moving forward. She continued, I come as an advocate of helpless, forgotten, insane, and idiotic men and women, of being sunk to a condition from which the most unconcerned would start with real horror, of beings wretched in our prisons and more wretched in our almshouses. And so, to show you how successful this kind of I suppose lobbying was in some sense, you can see how this is the number of admissions and resident patients in state and county mental hospitals from 1831 to 2005. And obviously, this is the resident patient population here, this curve here. And you can see, I mean, it's sort of remarkable how there's this inexorable rise in the number of patients that become resident within state hospitals. In point of fact, this probably pretty closely reflected also in part the rising population in the United States as well. So it's not that they were at points in time. The number of the rise in resident population did exceed the growth of the population in general, but for the most part, it remained pretty consistent. The peak of state hospital population is right here, 1955 or so. Coincidentally, it was the same time antipsychotic drugs were introduced, although I don't think there's a causal relationship, quite honestly, and pretty sure there isn't. I mean, most of the evidence suggests there isn't. But we'll go and get into that in a bit. And this whole period of time is considered a period of deinstitutionalization, which I'll also talk about in just a bit. This figure here is just to show, I mean, that there does seem, I mean, this isn't the best data, so I wouldn't like totally count on this as being completely the most accurate. But it does certainly suggest that as you can see, the number of people presumably with serious mental illness incarcerated certainly did decline with the introduction of widespread state hospitalization and state hospital and asylum care. And it also suggests, again, that the increase, at least in part, may be a consequence of deinstitutionalization since the mid-1950s. But we'll talk a lot more about that in just a bit. For the remainder of the talk, I'm going to focus on California for the most part. And I do want to emphasize, though, that I think what I have to say is relevant to the United States as a whole. California, and especially since the 1950s, has tended to lead the country in certain trends, both in terms of deinstitutionalization, incarceration, and homelessness. And so I think we are, in some sense, I mean, genuinely a bellwether state in certain ways. The first state asylum was constructed in 1853, which was about more or less 3 years after we became a state. You can see that as one asylum was built, the need continued to increase. It also, as I mentioned, reflects the growth of the state as well. So Napa was 1875, Agnews 1888, Mendocino 1893, and Patton 1893 as well. It's worth noting that the first, let's see, which ones? So the only ones left, Patton and Napa. I might, nearly everyone, nearly the vast majority in state hospitals today are forensic, which underlines that, as we'll see, the way in which care has become, serious mental illness has been criminalized. But more on that in just a little bit. What I want to emphasize, though, is that the arguments for asylums was this growing population, that there was a growing recognition of individuals that had insanity, as it was termed in the 19th century, that were becoming, it was impossible to ignore, especially the fact that they were increasingly at risk for becoming homeless or jailed, and that the asylum provided the most therapeutic and humane and medically scientific way of caring for individuals with serious mental illness. In the 20th century, the first half, again, we have 4 new hospitals were built in California: Norwalk in 1916, Camarillo in 1936, and DeWitt in 1946, and then finally Modesto in 1947. And I think Modesto might have been the last new one, although they're, Coalinga now, which is, again, a forensic psychiatric institution, is just recently opened. And there was also one in the middle of the state that was also opened, Atascadero, as a forensic institution in 1951. These institutions, though, were built at least with the belief that they were genuinely therapeutic. And this here is an image of one of the early buildings built in Stockton. And from the annual report, just to give you a flavor of what they believed they were doing in the 19th century, the intention in every such establishment being the restoration and comfort of the afflicted, the relief of their families, and the protection of the community. It is the economy, justice, and humanity to provide at once all the appliances necessary. And of course, I mean, this is an aspirational sort of statement, and the reality perhaps may have differed somewhat. Although I've just anecdotally, I've read a lot of patient records, and it does seem like they at least tried in California to provide, humane care. As elsewhere in the country, care in California state hospitals is predicated on moral therapy, and here's just a quote, and I kind of like the quote, so I'll read it in its full. In the moral treatment of patients, their reception and classification, their exercise and employment, their diet, cleanliness, and comfort are objects of the first importance and receive particular attention. The institution possesses an eligible and healthy situation, plain and substantial buildings, large, airy, and well-ventilated rooms, cold, warm, and shower baths, ample space for recreation, and grounds for labor with plenty of trees, shade, and pure air. By the way, this is Stockton again. I think the most important thing is to, at least the way that care and treatment were conceptualized, is they were one and the same in a certain way. You can't separate caring for an individual as well as providing treatment, that they were huge overlap, and really you couldn't separate them. And obviously context is, like place is really significant where you're caring for someone as well. That it has to take place within this kind of, and within a therapeutic institution. And like the other slide that I showed you, California mirrors it. This is showing the state resident population from 1855 to 1955. And again, you can see there's just a steady rise, quite rapid rise actually, up until 1955. The peak population in California similarly was in 1955. I want to make three kind of generalizations, conclusions, more or less. They're kind of generalizations. I'm not going to try to prove them all, but I think they're kind of true. Before we move on to the kind of final part of the story, and to about homelessness and serious mental illness and incarceration of those serious mental illness. But I think it is worthwhile kind of emphasizing, at least in that, these 3 points, because I think they're important to think about future policy too, perhaps. I don't, just in terms of, so number one is that state hospitals in and of themselves actually provided, I think, humane care despite occasional, sometimes egregiously horrendous abuses, but that happens everywhere. But and it's an empirical question that do institutions, can they provide humane care? I think overall they probably did. The second point I want to make is that lengths of stay were surprisingly short. We often have this image of these institutions as being these places where you come in and you never go out. That certainly wasn't the case. They were quite porous, in fact, in terms of providing the sort of social space that people could go if they needed it and then leave when they didn't need it. Then finally, and as I've tried to kind of intimate already, that care and treatment remain remarkably holistic, focused on both body and mind, surprisingly, even though we think of state hospitals as being the homes of lobotomy, of ECT, of electroconvulsive therapy, and these major, pretty, terrifying interventions. But they also provided other kind of, they believed in body and mind. Just to give you a little more concrete example, that here is length of stay, just randomly chose 3 years, just looking. So 1941, the average length of stay on discharge was 7.3 months. Now that sounds like a long time, but then if we really think about it, it isn't super long, especially for someone with serious mental illness. The average length of stay in 1949 decreased to 5.8 months. And then in 1951, decreased to 4.5 months. And the 1950s, I think, was probably really a golden age of state hospitals. It was after World War II. Budgets had, after a long period of time that budgets had remained, had plummeted somewhat because of the war effort. There was a huge amount of building and of hiring of staff, so that, in fact, the 1950s provided actually quite a different kind of perspective on what hospital care could be, or state hospital care could be. And then finally, just to give you one of my favorite quotes from 1951 again, is just to underline the expansive nature of what counted as treatment. Everything, this is from the director of California State Hospitals and California Department of Mental Hygiene. Everything done to, for, or around a mentally ill patient in California hospitals can be considered as therapy, since therapy is the ultimate purpose of everything done. I mean, it's a little tautological, but I think they kind of believed it. The next quote, just to give you another just flavor of it: the necessity of applying knowledge to a total situation rather than breaking a problem up into small parts has long been recognized by modern science, and psychiatry for many years has been fighting the tendency to disassociate mind from body in the treatment of mental illness. We now want to turn to this final epoch, but and I think it's characterized not only by deinstitutionalization, but also by abandonment of people with serious mental illness, and then the recriminalization is what I'm calling it, of serious mental illness. Though I'm not advocating for a return to the state hospitals necessarily, but I think what I'm trying to demonstrate is that there are different ways to think about care and treatment that might be productive ways of thinking about policy going forward. Just a couple myths that I think want to dispel. The first one being that deinstitutionalization was evidence-based set of policies based on proven inferiority of state hospital care and superiority of community care, is not true. I mean, at best, it's partially true, but there wasn't any systematic evidence to compare the two. It was based on a belief that the community is better without empirical evidence to that fact. What I already mentioned, 1954 introduction of Thorazine. It's believed that antipsychotic drugs is often attributed to being one of the major factors of deinstitutionalization. It's a little complicated to show that it's not, but I really don't think it is. Most people would, I think most scholars probably would agree with me on that. And then, finally, that the belief that deinstitutionalization is motivated by humanitarian concerns over the about the inhumane care of treatment at state hospitals. I think the real fact of the matter is that it was a fiscal decision ultimately, and that humanitarian concerns were not central. And in fact, what's fascinating to me, at least, is that the number of voluntary patients increased quite dramatically from the beginning of the century, in fact, to the 1960s. By the early 1960s, 40% of admissions were voluntary into state hospitals. Which is, and I think that was part of its downfall too, is that it was providing, the budgets were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. So the major contributors to deinstitutionalization, I think, was the fiscal crisis of state governments in the 1960s, and politicians wanting to cut spending in Reagan's election in '66 and becoming governor in '67 illustrates that he ran on trying to decrease government spending. Perhaps one of the biggest factors is the passage in 1965 of Medicaid and Medicare, and then in '72 the SSI, and then continued economic turmoil in the 1970s. This slide here, I just want to show you this, just a detail of the decline of population in California. And the only reason I put LPS here, which is the Lanterman and Petrus Short Act, and the only reason why I just wanted to point out that while it certainly helped depopulate the hospitals, it certainly wasn't a major, it wasn't the engine behind it. And the Lanterman and Petrus Short Act is the act that decreased, made it legally more difficult to keep people in state hospitals for more than, it defined much more precisely how long someone could be hospitalized. And it was for shorter periods of time. Oh, I'm so sorry. Did I mess up there? No, I didn't. Okay, good. With deinstitutionalization, this quickly led to the reappearance again of people with serious mental illness ending up being incarcerated. One of the earliest articles about what, calling it now criminalization of the mentally ill was in 1972. This is an article from California. It increasingly became evident that more and more individuals were being incarcerated in jails, primarily following deinstitutionalization. This is a really quick and dirty and not very scientific look at just looking at how often does homelessness and mental illness appear I use various search terms. But my looking in the LA Times from 1880 to 1999, and the whole, and so it's not, just to make the point that homelessness and serious mental illness as a kind of occurring together had virtually disappeared with state hospital care and reappeared as we deinstitutionalized. This is just to show homelessness in LA County, and as we all know, has been pretty inexorable in terms of its rise, and LA County being the epicenter of homelessness in the country now. With the most recent homeless count, LA has surpassed New York in terms of the total number of homeless. But even, and also very famously, LA has a lot more unhoused homeless individuals than New York or anywhere else in the country as well. A large proportion of our homeless are unsheltered. So as you can see, 48,000 according to the count. And the count, obviously, I think we all think is probably an undercount, especially because unhoused homeless individuals are such a large proportion of those who are homeless. Just to show that this slide, all I'm trying to show is this little number, like looking at serious mental illness and homelessness. It's an important part of homelessness, but it's not the entire story. And that number it's really hard, it's an estimate based on the point in time counts. And so whether it could be higher or lower, I'm not sure exactly. And I don't think anyone really knows. It's probably higher, but. This is just complicated, but the only point is that what it's looking at is the relationship between deinstitutionalization and criminalization. And the point being is that you see this line here is the rate per 100,000 people who are in state hospitals and is declining, and this here is those who are being incarcerated in jails and prisons with serious mental illness increasing. And so it's, yeah. How am I doing time-wise, by the way? 12:43. And when do I finish? Like 6, 7 more minutes. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Okay. This is a photo of Twin Towers, where probably 15 years ago, I think, is when they started segregating people with serious mental illness from the general population in LA County Jail. LA County Jail being one of the largest jails in the world, as well as in the country. It is, I think it's larger than Rikers now in terms of both the total population as well as the serious mental illness population. And Rikers is the main jail in New York City. And the thing about Twin Towers, it's also like the largest collection, and this is kind of a hard thing to wrap your mind. The population of individuals in this, again, I taking with a little grain of salt, but probably 5,000 or so of the inmates have serious mental illness. That is the largest collection of people with serious mental illness in the country. Probably it's claimed to be in the world. I'm not sure, and many are there largely by virtue of the fact that they do have a serious mental illness and have their misdemeanors or felonies, but are largely driven, I think, by their mental illness. On just a personal note, and I've gone to the jail quite a few times, and each visit kind of leaves me incredibly depressed and despairing. I've never seen so much psychiatric pathology and untreated because they're in the jail and not in a therapeutic space. And is that, I mean, you see patients masturbating in public, naked, smearing feces, catatonically posturing, which means they're either rigid, holding a posture for hours, or very excited. And it's hard not to feel kind of ashamed being a psychiatrist and watching all these treated individuals in such inhumane circumstances it's very hard to go. But this is just to show you. It's kind of a hard slide to read, but I do think it's worth just pointing out. And this is again in LA County Jail, and all I'm trying to show is. You see the proportion of people with serious mental illness has been rising from 14%, and that was in 2009. It's gone to 29% in 2018, and it continues to rise. It's rising both absolutely and relatively, as you can see, in terms of the general population. I kind of, to step back and ask, okay, so what does this have to do with mental health policy? Every major mental health policy since the 1970s has attempted to address this growing problem of both incarceration and homelessness in people with SMI. This is just looking at those from the 1990s onward of the major mental health policies in California. AB 3777 and AB 34 and 2034 were precursors to the Mental Health Services Act and helped provide the empirical basis for the Mental Health Services Act, the way in which it's structured around what are called full service partnerships meant to provide intensive treatment for people with serious mental illness at risk of homelessness, incarceration. Then moving on to other, that we have the AOT, assisted outpatient treatment, which was passed in 2002, but LA County didn't implement it until 2015. And then most recently, Newsom's Care Court, which I don't believe has been implemented yet, although LA is supposed to implement it this year, as well as a number of other counties. It's being staggered, I think, through both this year and next year. All of these, though, are aimed at trying to address this problem of incarceration and homelessness, and quite explicitly, and haven't, I think it's fair to say, have failed at least at solving the problem, and certainly the problem has gotten worse over time and not gotten better. And I think to understand that, it helps to understand some of the major changes in American political economy and culture since the 1970s. Some of these, they've been well documented, but I'll just briefly review them really quickly. These changes have included increasing deregulation and privatization, draconian cuts on non-defense public budgets, dismantling of the welfare state, and increasing wealth and income inequality have at least provided a background for a problem of homelessness and incarceration. Also, though, that what has justified these larger changes have been the ideological justification, at least, has been termed, and I'll just use it as a shorthand, neoliberalism. I mean, it's a way of both economic kind of policy as well as an ideology. And the ideology of neoliberalism just is a faith in market forces at righting social wrongs, that there's this belief in competition in the free market, according to this view, are the most effective moral means of organizing society, and consequently, and Reagan being one of the most famous, argued for contraction of government services and the deregulation and privatization of goods and services. A particular view of citizenship underpins this way of seeing, human nature that has, you can see this resonating through public mental health policy in terms of how we view treatment and the aim of treatment. It provides, I think, that what I'm terming neoliberalism, and many people have used the term, is that it's increased a focus on the individual as opposed to larger social solutions, perhaps, and focuses on individual responsibility, self-improvement, and individual empowerment. This, I think, is along with this larger context of increasing focus on the individual, has been a change in increasingly, and how we see psychiatric patients in psychiatry has become, I think, increasingly narrow in terms of what counts as psychiatric disease and its treatment, the wild success of the pharmaceutical industry being a really good example in terms of how, both they're marketing psychotropic drugs, but also marketing a way of seeing psychiatric disease that is very much focused on individual brain solution and biological reductionism. And then along with this narrowing, there has been an increased separation between what we count as care and cure, and what I've tried to suggest, at least in the state hospital era, there was seen as much. How am I doing time-wise? It looks like I'm getting close. I'm getting close. So mental health policy has been committed to policies that reinforce community-based interventions, and it's been an intensification away from trends, for long-term commitment for people with serious mental illness, and focused more on acute care, even if it's a year-long or 2 years, such as AOT is usually a year and you can renew it for another year. But the idea that you can treat mental illness, and if you treat it intensively, regardless of whether you're doing it voluntarily or involuntarily, you're going to solve the fundamental problem. This, I think, has kind of helped sort of reinforce the difficulties with coming up with this long-term solution to people with serious mental illness. They often become homeless and end up being increasingly vulnerable to becoming incarcerated. Since I'm getting close, I'm going to now conclude. I just want to say history teaches us. This is a quote from Gerald Grob, very famous historian, who I admire quite a bit. Unfortunately, he passed away a couple of years ago, but he wrote, history teaches us that there's a price for implementing ideology. Ooh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. Oh, drat. I'm so sorry. Let me get back. Okay. He writes, history, teaches us that the price for implementing ideology ungrounded in empirical reality and for making exaggerated rhetorical claims. Tragically, sorry about that. I didn't mean to do that. And so what I want to conclude, at least, that those with serious mental illness have suffered the most for our ideological commitments. Clearly, that our commitments to a fantasy of how treatment ought to be doesn't necessarily match reality, especially as we see homelessness and incarceration of people with serious mental illness simply worsening over, in spite of the billions and billions of dollars that we've invested in trying to solve the problem. I think, and as a psychiatrist, we have a particular dislike for the past, and we often believe that each new generation is smarter and more humane than the next, and that we possess better interventions than our predecessors. And while I think this conceit might occasionally be correct, I think, if anything, this history suggests us that the age of the asylum and state hospital deserves a second look, not so much as a way of solving our problems, but giving us inspiration for creating new solutions. That I think if we can reconceptualize our current beliefs about psychiatric illness, treatment, and care, and I think for the sake of those dying in the streets, and we've been doing this study looking at death of homeless individuals in LA County, it's just sort of that I think hopefully we can learn something from this history. So thank you very much.
So thanks very much, Joel. So we have time for a few questions. I've got a quick one, and then maybe one from Zoom, and perhaps we'll have one from the studio audience here. I thought it was really fascinating that there was a contraction of psychiatry's conception of what it took to treat serious mental illness at the same time that the science itself was taken off, allowing that it wasn't Thorazine that resulted in this, but just as neurotransmitters were starting to get discovered and we were beginning to understand mental illness as residing in part within the brain.
Yeah.
Do you see that, is that cause and effect, or was that sort of a side effect of science getting derailed or misinterpreted?
I think getting misinterpreted, I do think, and I mean, so much of our, especially discovery of neurotransmitters actually was fairly recent. If we think about when we first discovered that the neurotransmission was the kind of critical thing, was in the late 1950s, early 1960s, and psychotropic drugs played a critical role in that discovery. But I think I don't think it's so much a matter of science, but how we've interpreted science and how the pharmaceutical industry has helped promote a kind of a simple story about serious mental illness in general, for good reason. I mean, they're trying to make profit. It makes total sense. But I think psychiatry has been seduced by that a little too easily.
Great, thank you. So, and we have a question from Zoom in terms of how should public policy approach treatment of the substance use disorder as well as other mental health conditions?
I think that's a great question. I think it's kind of a question, both for substance, I hate to say this, but I know much more about serious mental illness without substance abuse, even though they co-occur. But that's part of the problem is, of our kind of dividing things up in the world. But anyway, so that's an excuse for me not having a really good answer for substance abuse in particular. I do think, I think what we need to do, though, is to refocus on what we think are the goals of intervention and treatment, and maybe have a more kind of a larger perspective that treatment isn't just all we can do with our drugs, for example, and psychotropic drugs, is treat symptoms. We're not treating the fundamental aspect of the disorder. And what we need to, I think, be thinking about is how we can address kind of and what I think are more fundamental questions about how we can help people achieve meaning in their lives, and what are the structures that we need in order to do that. Of course, we want to help symptoms, and I'm a psychiatrist, and I prescribe antipsychotic drugs all the time, but I think we need to think much more broadly than just the kind of quelling of symptoms or even providing housing. We need to think how we can integrate life for people who have difficulties with that.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.